Inside the Juno Reactor.
Hi, Brad.
Hi there.
Nice to have you inside the Juno Reactor.
It's good to be here.
We first met at the Famous City Film Festival, and it was because I was doing the Mona Lisa Overdrive track, and we were celebrating your Terminator suite. But before we get into that, I'd really like to sort of go back in time. And what was the first sort of realization that you wanted to do music, or that pulled you to want to do music?
Well, I grew up in an artistic household. My dad was a musician. I sat as he gave piano lessons under the piano as a little kid.
Okay.
Literally under the piano. And, it was just always there. So it wasn't a decision. It was just life. It was breathing. It was, I think I wrote my first composition at about 6 years old. And it was some kind of march on the piano where I actually had my left hand going. And it was very martial, which I don't know why, but that's what came out of me at 6 years old. It was like, I think I thought I was writing an anthem for some branch of the military service. I just remember that thought. It's like the Navy.
Because your dad was in the army, or
yeah, no, I don't know.
What sort of music was he playing then?
He was jazz mostly. He was very improvisational, but he was all around. He graduated from Juilliard in New York.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so he got in there on the GI Bill. Poor kid from Brooklyn, and so he.
So who was he really into?
He was into anything that was good, well done.
Because it was all happening in New York at that time, wasn't it?
A lot. He played with some famous jazz people. There were a lot of young musicians coming out of the army at the end of the war, World War II, and they were all around New York. I mean, he didn't play with Miles Davis or whatever, but he played with some name people, but he wasn't ultimately...
What an amazing time to be in New York, to be a musician, for all of this like amazing music suddenly to being given birth and rising. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I think that I remember him playing one of the pieces that fascinated me, which I think had an impact actually way later on, was Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra and Percussion. So we're talking pretty out there stuff at the time, and then he just he played jazz all the time, and it was just a wide variety of things.
And so what did he think of you taking that course as well?
Well, the first thing that happened was, and the biggest mistake was, he was my piano teacher. Don't do it. Don't teach your kid how to drive, and don't be their teacher in any particular.
It didn't work.
No, it does not work at all. And therefore, to this day, there's certain things I wish I knew about music. I think of myself as kind of a primitive creator because I rebelled against him at a crucial point. I was playing Mozart sonatas and all that stuff, and I just hit my early teens as the Beatles arrived. Right.
And you saw the Beatles.
My first live concert was Shea Stadium with the Beatles.
Wow.
And my uncle, who was only 5 years older than me, was like an apprentice to ABC News. So I was on the field running film cams to the cameramen, film cans. And like literally the Beatles, there was a police barricade and they walked, I could have touched them. They walked right by me.
And you could hear it.
I could hear it. Absolutely.
And what was it like?
It was not bad, I mean, the sound, I imagine if you were up in the stadium, I mean, so you got it's baseball, right? And Shea Stadium, and there's the dugouts and the hallways behind, and there were literally, the halls were lined with young women on gurneys who had completely freaked out and were like sobbing and shaking and stuff. So I was committed at that point to be a rock and roll star. When I saw the girls going crazy for them, I wasn't an athlete. There was nothing sexy that I could do except music, So that was a formative.
How old were you then?
Time. 14, 13, 14,
Wow.
7th grade.
What an amazing experience to have, to see them as well.
Yeah, and to the scope of it. I mean, that was my first live. I'd never seen a live band. You know, I'd been playing their music. I was playing the Ventures, which was like a California instrumental surf group. You know, I could kind of play the guitar at that point. But yeah, it was amazing, and all kinds of things. It was a wild weekend. And my uncle, I don't know, he was like 19, he had all 18, he had all these connections. And I was in an apartment in Greenwich Village with this guy, a big black guy named Angel, was wearing the first granny glasses I'd ever seen, which became the style. And then there, Dylan has this, he was a friend of Dylan's, and Dylan has a line in his song, Angel comes in from the coast or something. I went, that was Angel. And this gal, now this really cemented my desires. This gal, beautiful blonde woman, dressed in a white towel and white go-go boots, walked out from the back of this apartment. And I'm like, I mean, I'm a 13-year-old boy, right? And then she goes back and someone said, that's Dylan's gift to Paul McCartney.
No.
So I had a very quick coming of age into the concept of the...
And that's when sort of Manhattan was ready, Manhattan.
Oh yeah, and Greenwich Village was, you know, I mean, Bob Dylan was playing in Greenwich Village at that point at Gertie's Folk City, and a lot of people, big influence. Frank Zappa had a residency. He and the Mothers of Invention had their own theater.
Wow.
Upstairs, and it was one of the few places as an underage person, not drinking age, because the clubs, a lot of them you couldn't go into because they were serving alcohol, but you could go see the Mothers of Invention. It was this little theater. And
Frank Zappa's amazing as well, isn't he?
he just had a really big influence on me, kind of stretching my imagination as far as some of the limitations of 3-chord rock and roll, you know?
Yeah, I remember listening to the Grand Mazoo, and just totally off this planet, really.
Yeah.
And your mother was a dancer.
She was a modern dancer. I think she would have been in the Martha Graham dance company, which was like it for modern dance, except that she got pregnant with me. And she moved basically into teaching. Both my parents ended up opening a school of the arts. And I grew up in the middle of it.
Wow.
And my best training for scoring films was how I earned pocket money as a teenager, improvising as an accompanist for my mom's improvisational modern dance classes.
Wow.
That was a big deal because I had to watch these young people improvising and moving and think, what does that sound like? Like this. I had no delay. I had to be right. If
So it's like black and white films, sort of early films where the player would play to the film.
Yeah, all the time. Well, silent movies, they would play
silent
live
movies,
to the film. In fact, my grandfather played live. He was a violinist, and he played to the silent movies on 14th Street.
By himself?
No, with an orchestra.
Wow.
And what's interesting is we had a little exchange, and you were talking about pre-written parts, partimento, whatever that ended up being. And all of a sudden I had this realization, and my grandfather, who spoke in a very thick Yiddish Eastern European accent, would explain something to me. He's numbers. We just play the numbers. I'm like, what's that? So you have a conductor, you have a film showing, and he has written a thing for himself, number 3, number 7, and these were parts, sections of different kind of emotional feelings that you had to have memorized if you were in his orchestra. So he would go, number 3. You had to play the chase music. Oh, and now it's sad. Number 5. You know, and they knew all these little predetermined sections of music, and that's
it's a bit
how
like
they did
Prince, I think, as well, because Prince, I went up to this place called the Rock Gardens where he did a little private party after his big show at Wembley or something. And I had a broken leg, so I was sort of leaning up against the PA system right beside him. And he had all these little hand signals behind his back that would sort of, all the musicians were just looking at his fingers. And they were like little signs to the musicians.
Wow.
But fantastic sort of period of time that, again, the sort of your coming of birth of a composer? Or what made you actually even think, because you were in Daryl Hall and John Oates's band as a keyboard player?
For like a tour, a 6-month tour. And at the same time, an old friend of mine, actually one of my dad's piano students, was he came out of art school and he was making his first kind of experimental feature. And he had gotten in touch with me while I was on tour with Daryl and John and said, I'd like you to do the music for he'd heard me playing, and I was creating music at that time, but not in any organized kind of way, except singer-songwriter stuff. And he said, do you want to do the music for this? Because he knew he could get me cheap. And I said, sure, but I'm on tour. And he said, well, when are you back? And the dates jived up to the point where he had a dance sequence, and I actually got Daryl and John and the band into the studio to record this James Brown kind of funky dance sequence music. And tour, nothing to do all day except for an hour and a half, wake up in the morning and write music all day and get paid well. I'm thinking, and that's when I started to move towards film.
And what was that film called?
It was called Apple Pie. I think it's available somewhere. It was just, art students' idea of experimental film at the time. Howard went on to make some other interesting films, but I think it was fun in a way. In fact, there's the dance sequence that Daryl and John played on with me. The movie Fame has a very famous dance sequence in the streets of New York where all these different people, they copied that from Howard's film. That was his vision. We did that scene, or a very low budget version of it, where everybody's walking down the street and then all of a sudden they feel the beat and they start to dance, and everybody on cabs and, priests walking by and cabbies and garbage guys and.
How did you write for those scenes? Did you watch it to picture, or did you just write the stuff and then?
We didn't have the ability to be writing music at home with the picture because there was no...
So were you just writing to script?
I was writing to having seen the film and then timing out sequences in the editing room and then going back and saying, I need this here. There's a lot of stuff we did to click track. And if you were at a certain tempo, we had a click track book with all these pages saying, if you're at metronome, blah, 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 the cut, because I was trying to score to picture, which meant 4 cuts and stuff. It wasn't like now where they just take library music sometimes and they just cut it. I was trying to actually be a film scorer. So there was a lot of computation until you recorded and brought it to the editing room and the editor dropped it in. You're always kind of like, oh, I hope I did my multiplication of, of the frame rate and all that properly.
Because there's some amazing films, aren't there? Like, I think Lawrence of Arabia. I was always imagining how the hell were you, how were you writing that stuff if you have to do, working it on and without digital computers now? I mean, I've always done it on digital computers.
Well, it was interesting because I'm an old timer and I had to do all this calculation, right? But the way that composers worked, and they did in a Hollywood film, and I'm sure over here in the UK, in the big studios, they did project the film while the orchestra was playing. In fact, we used techniques called streamers and punches. So if you knew you had to hit the thing where the guy gets shot or whatever, you would have a streamer, a 3-foot streamer, and a punch as a warning, and then a streamer and a punch, and you knew you had to get the orchestra there at that point. Or if you, as in my case, in some cases, improvising, I would know what to do. Before synthesizers, and I was one of the first guys, and I got cursed by a lot of other composers who figured out how to build a home studio so that I could mock up the score with whatever was available at the time.
So after these early films, what was the catalyst to doing Terminator?
Getting hired, having a job. Yeah. The catalyst was...
But you hadn't heard of James Cameron because he didn't really have a name. And
he didn't really have a name, and I had some hesitancy on the part of my agents who... The original company, now remember, Terminator, The Terminator, the first one, was a low-budget action picture with an unproven director. And the company that made it, I think, was UK-based. It was Orion was kind of the name on it, but Hemdale Pictures, Derek Gibson and somebody over here, and my agents had an earlier low-budget picture that they made where the composers didn't get paid properly or didn't get paid in a proper amount of time or something. So they were not happy with them as producers to work for. So they actually said, no, don't do it. Well, what happened was, okay, Jim Cameron got a cassette back in the day of just a pastiche of my music that my agent sent. And he was driving around, I found out later, in his car, listening to it for a few weeks and thought, oh, there's something there that interests me. So he came and showed me the movie, and I showed him some other work that I had been doing that really was closer to what he needed. And he was like, yeah, okay. And then the agent said, no, you don't work for these guys. You won't get paid and blah, blah, blah. And then this young woman working in the office said, Brad, you got to do this film. And once I saw it, I knew that I had to do it. He was the first guy. When you're a film composer, especially early on, you sit with a filmmaker and they tell you about their film. Wow, it's like, this is the part where I'm saving the world because of my ideas and my photography and the perform. And they have these ideas very often about, and then they show you the film and you go, oh, well, it's not really there what he thinks is there, but my classic line was, I think the music can really make a contribution. Not save it, but make a contribution, because I couldn't say this is the best film because I just didn't have the kiss-ass genes. But anyway, he was the first guy who told me about what was on his mind in the film. And then when I saw the film, I thought, yeah, okay, he did that.
And what was your interaction with, you call him Jim, don't you?
Yeah.
Jim Cameron. Healthy?
It was good. I mean, we did 3 pictures together. We did Terminator, Terminator 2, and True Lies. And most of our work together was one-on-one in my studio. It was respectful, quiet. I needed to hit the mark 99.9% of the time, because if I didn't, I could feel how it could go. There's a loss with directors if your musical idea is really, they don't get it for what they want. They kind of lose confidence in you a little bit. There's an erosion of trust, and that's really hard to regain. So I have to say, in 3 films, there are only like a few pieces where I was maybe not going the direction. He gave me a lot of freedom. He's a control freak, but he gave me a lot of freedom. I would see his films without any music in it, and I would go out and imagine what it should be.
And what was the system that you were using that was enabling you to do these mock-ups? And
it evolved quite a bit. But early on, when I got out to Los Angeles, so I would say in about 1982 or so, I built a full 24-track studio where we used SMPTE because I didn't have a projector, but they would transfer the film to a 3/4-inch video cassette, and 1 track was sound with the dialogue, and 1 track was SMPTE code, which would be fed to the 24-track machine, so that I had a special brain for syncing the two. It was very complicated back then, and sometimes it would fly away. It wasn't, got a lot easier.
Especially if you recorded on track 23.
Yeah, because the interference, and I was on not the most expensive, like an Otari 2-inch 24-track, and it wasn't like a Studer or something. It was.
And what synths were you using?
Well, in the first Terminator, I had the Oberheim, what we called it the Oberheim chain, OBXA, and a Oberheim drum machine, and a little Oberheim sequencer, very simple sequencer. Okay. So a lot of that basso ostinato in Terminator 1, which we had trouble with at Musette because somebody was trying to play that live, which should never have happened. But it, that kind of stuff was generated by that little sequencer. Then I had one of the first emulator samplers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the first one, Emulator 1 or Emulate.
Because I did a track in Nosfran in Brooklyn. and it was in Run DMC studio, and they had one of the early emulators there.
Yeah.
That was like, I think 84.
Yeah, well,
85.
that's 84 is when I was doing Terminator. So the famous sound, which I've gotten questions from composers over the years, is the clank that's in the Terminator theme. And that was the emulator with a really shitty mic, excuse the expression, shitty mic on it. And I got samples, it was early sample days, but a real anvil, an orchestral anvil, just sounded like chink. It didn't have the that I wanted. And I went in and in frustration, got my big cast iron frying pan and a nice heavy hammer, held it like this mic and just surrounded the mic with it way too close and just bam, like that into this very lo-fi sampler. And the distortion, everything, all I needed to do was add a little reverb and that was that sound.
It's been quite heavily sampled as well, post.
I think so.
I've sampled loads of stuff off Terminator.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, the beginning of sampling, I had an S900, and yeah, that's one of the films I took loads of sounds off.
Oh, sweet. There are certain kinds of scores where click can kind of be deadly because it's so mechanical, right? So if you have an orchestral thing and there needs to be a flow, it's like if you're a musician, you can say, oh, they did that to click because it doesn't have this emotional...
There's quite a lot of tempo, time signature changes in that piece as
Yeah, there is, but it's about a machine.
Exactly.
And it needs to be, with all its changes and shifts, and my thing with that was I'd been hearing a lot of rock scores were a big deal in the 80s, and hearing a lot of 4/4 stuff on chase scenes. I thought, what's wrong with that? It's just not feeling exciting to me. Yeah, well, when I realized this, if you have a time signature with 5 or 7, it's not, the gravity of it doesn't just sit there. It's kind of falling forward.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, it doesn't sit so comfortably. And
it's like putting 7s against 4s, and it's really nice the sort of way it just moves over things.
So that's what I was playing with. It was like, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to be shifting time signatures so you don't get comfortable, so you don't get too comfortable.
Yeah.
And that was Jim Cameron's big thing about the first one especially. He said, I don't want the audience in their heads. I want them on like I would try to throw in the heroic theme when they escaped from the police station, and he would go, that was one of the few times he went, no. I said, but they made it. It's this little, it's so dark. There's this moment where they made it out. And he said, you know what? That engages a part, this is a guy who knew what he wanted, right? That engages a part of the brain where you have to think, oh, that's the theme. Oh, that means this. Oh, he said, no, you're just supposed to be like, ha, 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 like that the whole time. So that's what that score was, basically. A lot of it, except for a few moments in it,
When you're at the dub stage, how disappointed are you with the volume of the music? Is that something that goes into your brain, or do you think, God, I wish it was louder? 'Cause, funnily enough, last night, I shouldn't have done this, but I finished here about 2, and then I got home and I thought, okay, I'm going to put on the Terminator.
Oh, God.
So I put on Terminator 2, and I was watching it, and I was listening to it quietly, because originally I saw the Terminator, the very first film. Me and Norma were going through London late at night, and we thought, oh, let's go and see a film. And there was just one cinema that we could still get into, and it was the Terminator. Walked into the theatre, and every seat was packed. We got the last 2 tickets. It was an amazing feeling. It's one of the few memories of being in a cinema where it's totally packed and everyone is, as you're saying, on the edge of the seat. It was an amazing experience to see that like that.
Well, what's interesting, going back to your question, very relevant to that, is that if you saw it in 1984, whatever that was, that film was in mono with an optical soundtrack.
Oh.
What that means is all the sound effects, the dialogue, and the music are coming out of one channel, and the optical soundtrack means it can only go up to 85 decibels pressure, which when you go to a movie now, it's about 110 or more. So it didn't have visceral impact. Now, I would play it for Jim in the studio pretty loud because I was
excited
in it. And then we got to the dub stage, going back to your question, and Jim, as a newish filmmaker, was like going, "What happened? It doesn't sound like it did. It's not exciting. What's happening?" And I had actually been scoring films for a number of years then. I mean, people think that was the beginning of my career, but I had been working in some really interesting high-level TV special projects and different things and low-budget features. And I had been through the dubbing process and I knew the limitations. And I said, well, that's as loud as it can get on an optical soundtrack, number one. Number two, it's mono, and stereo existed, but Orion Pictures, who later took credit for the success of, wouldn't pay the $50,000 more to mix it in stereo. Way, way down, MGM did a special edition, and we remixed everything up at Lucas Skywalker Ranch. And that's glorious. That's, I think that's probably available on DVD.
And was that the same with Terminator 2?
No, that was one of the big progressions. But the bottom line is, what was interesting is you've heard films from the era, many, many decades of mono optical, where the excitement comes from is choices that are made by the moment. So the new school of audio and filmmaking is throw the kitchen sink at it and make it loud, right? Back then they had to say, is this a musical moment? Is this a truck noise moment? Is this a dialogue moment? And they would rehearse the reels, because I had to do it once without punching every 10 minutes of film. And they would literally, as actors say, give and take stage. They would decide, the director would say, I really want to hear the music here. And they would pull back on the motor sounds. Now it's like you watch a car race, the motor's roaring and the music's roaring and everything's going at once. So there are ways to psychologically, psychoacoustically make you feel the excitement without the actual destroying of your eardrums, But Terminator 2 was optical Dolby stereo. So at least we had left, center, and right, and that increased the field in a sense of where we could put the sound.
Which of the other films of James Cameron would you have liked to have scored?
I talked to him and we had a really good meeting about Titanic. And I have to tell you, I think I had to talk about acceptance. He decided to go to James Horner for that. And I think it was a right choice, because I never would have written that song for that movie.
Which song?
The big, huge hit. He wrote this song. Jim didn't even ask for it. And he had this vision of this contemporary song to end that movie. And it was part of the reason the movie was so successful. And so I had to hand it to him. I said, it's a period piece thing. I wouldn't have gone there at that point. Now it's very acceptable to have everybody wants a contemporary hit song to a movie. They don't care if it takes place in the 1600s or where it takes place. But back then, that was not the rule. And James Horner had the vision for that.
Do you watch films and then go, I wish I'd done that score? Or that score's so crap, I wish I'd done it? Or that's so great, I wish I'd done it?
Occasionally, it's in my bones after doing it for like 25 years. It's in my bones what's really involved. I mean, what life is like when you actually do it. So like when I saw Titanic, there's part of me, I wish I was part of that project. And then there's part of me saying, wow, that must have been just, it's very hard. Composers don't have anything that protects their working conditions. So they literally can keep working on the film to the last minute and deliver you the cut that you need to write. And there's no human. I mean, Terminator was, the last 3 weeks was, I think I was working 18 hours a day, So that doesn't happen that often. I admire scores sometimes. I can't tell you whose and the names. I try to just be an audience. What happens is, as you get which was a learning thing for me. And I've gotten the question often, like, where did you go? You know, it's like,
why did you stop?
it was kind of a mutual agreement. I wasn't being offered the kind of projects that excited me. Mm-hmm. And at the same, but that's mutual. In other words, those projects weren't coming to me. Mm-hmm. We could talk about agents and representation and I had friends in the industry saying, you weren't even presented for this. You would have been a natural. Why weren't you presented for this? You know, that kind of thing haunted me for a while. I kind of let it go and feel like I kind of was there in a golden age where I was allowed to really play, you know, really had some freedom. The bigger the film got, if you weren't working for Jim Cameron, Jim had control of his film. But most films that got up into that budget realm, like this picture, Striking Distance, it was a Bruce Willis vehicle about a river cop that I did, which was fun, and Johnny Mnemonic that I did with Keanu Reeves.
Pre-Matrix film.
Yeah, fun projects, but so corporate and studio involvement and director that you're working with getting fired, but you're being asked to stay on, and just this pressure that's happened a lot in all industries about bottom line for the stockholders, right? I mean, it's like not about what is the artistic thing that'll serve best. So, things changed quite a bit.
So what did you do when you stopped doing film composing?
Well, right from the time of True Lies, which was about, 95 maybe, which was a real fun picture. I had this fateful feeling because that was peak. I was doing really great. And I got to put together both of my worlds in that movie, which was 110-piece orchestra at my disposal, and all the playing around and creating weird things in my studio, all combined. And I watched that happen on the stage at the old MGM studios where all the great musicals were recorded. And there was a little part that said, okay, you did it. You had this, which I want to talk to you about because I had an interesting experience with your Instagram account just a few days ago. But no, it was interesting. So all that kind of playful experimentation, like I want there to be a sound for an element of this movie that nobody's ever heard before, that kind of thing. And what is it? And finding it and playing around and making sounds and all that stuff with a little more classical type thing because ego gets involved, and I wanted to do the big orchestral scores, the John, that kind of thing. I wanted to show that I could do it. So all those muscles got flexed, and there was a point where the sessions were over, and I watched the premiere in Westwood, and they closed down a whole section of the middle of town, and we're walking out down the street in Westwood to this is when they used to do huge premiere parties. There was a Harrier jet at the party, and like guard towers and guys walking around with AK-40, actors walking around. And this was the party, was in this big parking lot or something. And my music is blasting through Westwood with big orchestra and all this stuff. And I thought, okay, so that's done. Now, what am I going to do now?
Did you ever get creative blocks in that period? Have you ever fought against them?
The pressure was so great. The fear of not completing on time, you sign these contracts, the music is the last thing, right? So if you don't deliver on time, they can...
I suppose it's different because you're writing for a picture. Yes. when I'm
so
doing
that picture
albums,
always exists.
Exactly, the story exists.
But there's sometimes a piece that you just don't know the answer to, and that can be hard. But the actual block comes when I do my own work.
And how do you get around it?
I got to a point, and so that's what I was doing, overlapping your previous question, from around the time of True Lies, when I had that sense of being completed with a certain phase, I started to create my own projects. I created an animated musical, and I had this wonderful artist who happens to be my brother-in-law creating worlds and characters, and I was writing songs and music, and got to the top of Warner Brothers Animation, almost had it made, but it was an original story, and they were really making age-old stories for the most part, Beauty and the Beast, or something that the audience was already familiar with, and they just weren't ready to go. That was before Pixar was really going nuts. So anyway, I had started to branch off into my own work, and I was inspired. I was on a roll, and the energy came from that. Afterwards, there were periods in the early 2000s where I just stopped for a while. I became a surf bum. I learned how to surf and became a surf bum, you know. And then had to turn it into something creative, so I designed and built a surf hotel in Mexico, just as a, you know, little thing that I
That's
thought
a
I'd
really
try.
nice way of doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I find like those sort of creative moments, they're like, it's a bit like you're pregnant and you're just waiting for the new ideas to be born.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it really painful and, you know, annoying.
It's very painful. I think it's almost a bit of a mental illness, this idea that I always have to be producing, creating. You know, I mean, if you go,
yeah, there is.
what about just being? I'm always a little haunted if I'm not involved making something. I'm kind of working against that a little bit now. You know, it's like I'm finding being present and, you know, getting older and whatever, but I still find myself.
And what music do you listen to now if you're just like chilling?
Very little. Very little. It's a big complaint my family has. They're like the shoemakers' kids, you know, who don't have shoes. It's like my head's going and I'm very I can't just listen to music. I'm like going into it and analyzing it and understanding it and stuff. So I tend not to listen for recreational listening.
What about synthesizers? Do you fancy playing with a synthesizer?
Well, I played with some of your toys and I was like, whoa, things have changed, you know? And then I feel like, you know, I put so much brain space into learning every new form of synthesis that came along for a while that I really got to a place where I said, you know, there's a certain kind of tired that I get, like a blood sucked out of me learning a new technology, something about that I kind of backed off of it.
I think you're lucky as you are a very rounded musician. I think we're very much moving away from the sort of very, you know, computerized music and the more free-flowing players playing. It's where you know, it's funny with like films like Terminator where they're depicting the future and we're actually in that transition now.
Very much so.
With AI, with the threat of nuclear war, with states going absolutely crazy, politicians being totally unreliable. Maybe they've always been totally unreliable. But it seems like we're almost in that. We've actually entered the Terminator world as much as we've entered like things like the Matrix world.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
It's like
I mean,
future, present.
If I was an ultimately intelligent machine, whatever you want to call it, if I had ultimate intelligence and could look at it all, I would say, human beings are destroying this place. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that would just be rational in a sense. I mean, it's like having a weird parasite and the patient's getting more and more ill. Get rid of the parasite. I think that we evolved technologically way faster and beyond our kind of spiritual, empathetic ability to feel the cause and effect of what we do to other people, what we do to resources, what we do to nature. Somehow we're able to do it, or at least part of the population is able to do it, and just move forward until it's going to all be a mess, you know? So, yeah, I think those films were good science fiction. That's what it is. It's the morality tales, really, you know? And it's intense to think about where we're heading. And I think it's one of the reasons that I like to be doing something that distracts me a bit. Some other thing is saying, oh, I can be passionate about this, because if I think about everything else, it's not a happy thing.
It's not great.
No.
It's not great for sure. But you've also been writing musicals lately, haven't you? Was it Full Circle?
Full Circle, which is on YouTube as an audio only. It's like an audiobook musical. Yeah, that was a labor of love. I mean, it related to my background, my grandfather. It's a totally fictional story, but I based it on certain elements of my story. my aunts, my grandfather, and things that happened to both Jews and Gypsies in Europe during World War II and the Holocaust and all that. It's not about that, but it is. It has a thread of that story running through it, but it's really about the main characters. Because a musical works best when you hit a certain point where a character needs to sing. They can't speak what they're feeling. They need to sing it. And that, to me, is the way a musical works the most organically. So yeah, I've been doing that. I'm working with kids, working with little first graders, trying to bring them some of the creativity I got exposed to when I was a kid, because it served me well in my life. But I want to tell this one thing before I forget. So I guess after we met last time, I think I followed you or something, and something came up. There was a visual of you with a bow, pulling a bow across like a tongue of metal.
Yeah.
And it looked like a real organized little instrument. I don't know, I wanted to ask you about that.
It's made by Leaf Audio. And it's got springs. It's got microphones inside. It's an amazing machine.
Yeah.
And it can but you do need a really good unit with it, which is, I can't remember the make of it, but this reverb unit that really brings it all to life.
Into space.
And it's very organic, sort of science fiction noises.
So what that did to me, it was like it was this time machine, because I realized, and it's so funny because I was just grabbing stuff like the frying pan and whatever, but I've done a lot of work with bows on odd things, and it's nothing new. I mean, people have been working with what they call prepared piano, where they put plates of metal in a piano. I was at the Tate Modern, and there's this whole time period in the very early 1900s where Expressionism was birthed. And there were groups of musicians and artists and dancers, and they were all looking at the possibility of leaving behind classicism and moving directly to the impact of visuals, of sound, right into a being and the effect that it has. So it's like the beginnings of abstract painting, and the beginnings of certain kinds of modern dance expression, and Schoenberg, beginnings of moving into tonality that isn't always pretty and organized like Bach might be. And anyway, so that's been on my mind, but I saw that bow going across the thing, and I remembered my curiosity about sound. And later I used that curiosity and put it to work in films and stuff. But first was the curiosity with no purpose whatsoever. I had one of the early synthesizers, and I noticed, wow, when you take two oscillators and you start them together and slowly move them apart, a third phantom sound appears, this overtone that you didn't create. It's just there in the air because of the reaction between the other frequencies.
I think I'm more interested now about that, in that sort of area where you've got a very analog type being that you then take it into the digital world.
Right.
And that's why, in a way, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been learning to play the viola and then create sort of effects that are not obvious to anything.
Right.
More like, because we're doing this project called Electronic Penderecki.
Right.
Where I'm working with this composer called Jan in Poland and the Sinfonetta Krakowa. And that to me is really exciting.
I heard that,
really
and
exciting.
the way that you wove your sounds very subtly, like not dominating what was happening, but just kind of adding this. It didn't even feel like adding. You just kind of went in there and joined what the strings.
I think we're being very respectful at the moment.
Yes.
And I think, because obviously there's the Penderecki estate and they were really nervous about it, but we're going to be doing some other shows, much longer shows. And I think we're going to abstract yet again what we've done. So I'm looking at these instruments like the Leaf Audio because I want it to be a live thing. And the electronics far more live.
Yeah. What that did for me, that little kind of creative light flashing before me, was clarified something about this kind of almost childish curiosity as being the beginning of everything. Now, at the same time, I was writing songs as a teenager about my heartbreak or whatever. So there was that kind of evolved into maybe the musicals, right? But that curiosity about sound and not being tied to anything particular, instrumentally or anything, started in its own right. And then I ended up utilizing it as a film composer. But it had its own life. And I kind of like that because there's something about that creative curiosity that's kind of pure in a way.
I think so as well. Yeah. And I think you've done it brilliantly in your sound pieces.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's been really nice to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Thanks for coming.
I hope I didn't talk your ear off.
I think you made the dog go to sleep.
Nah, he was sleeping before, weren't you?